Hello and welcome to Data for the Public Interest, Utility and Regulatory Possibilities for Empowering Energy Equity with Data. I am Dominic Libertor, Logistics and Finance Officer for CPI. It's actually been a while. I feel like we haven't had one of these. It's only been a month, but there's been so many other meetings. I feel like it's been a while here. So I'm here with Jasmine McAdams, my colleague. We did the majority of the work on this webinar, and I will get started here with just a quick intro for those of you first joining us for this innovation series. First, what is NARUC? We are the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, founded in 1889. Our members are state regulatory commissioners in all 50 states and territories. FERC and FCC are also members. And our members regulate electricity, natural gas, telecom, and water utilities. And in Washington, transportation. So what is our department? What is the Center for Partnership and Innovation? Essentially, we're a grant-funded team. We have 4 major topic areas, but we have a range of grants that we do, from DOE to NIST, Department of Commerce, and we identify emerging challenges and connect state commissions with expertise and strategies. And we build relationships, develop resources, and deliver many trainings. And you can find out more about our trainings at www.naruc.org/CPI-1. There's a bunch of different topic areas. There's a lot of resources on there, so I definitely encourage you to check it out. All right, so I will get started with introducing our moderator, Commissioner Ann Rendell from the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. Commissioner Rendell was appointed to serve as Commissioner of the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission by Governor Inslee in December 2014. She currently serves as Chair of the Electricity Committee and member of the Critical Infrastructure Committee for NARUC. She also serves on our Board of Directors. So Commissioner Rendell, please take over. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dominic. I appreciate it. I'm honored to be moderating the panel today. And let me turn on my camera. We're having a few bandwidth issues, so hopefully that will work. So good afternoon, everyone. As the description for this panel notes, the Washington State Legislature enacted the Clean Energy Transformation Act, or CETA, in 2019, which required utilities to provide 100% clean electricity to their customers by 2045, and do so in a way that ensures that all customers are benefiting from the transition to clean energy. CETA amended statutes that govern the utility integrated resource plans and created a new planning requirement for utilities known as the Clean Energy Implementation Plan, which the utilities have to prepare every 4 years to demonstrate how they will meet the law's requirements. Our commission is responsible for adopting rules to implement the act and to ensure compliance for the investor-owned utilities in our state. We adopted rules in December of this last year, of 2020, that among other things requires utilities to engage members of the public in developing their IRPs and clean energy implementation plans, to establish and engage with equity advisory committees, as well as the existing low-income conservation planning and IRP advisory committees, and to demonstrate how the utilities are considering input from the public and advisory committees. The rule also requires utilities to look at benefits and burdens to vulnerable populations and highly impacted communities in their IRPs and their clean energy implementation plans. These assessments will be informed by a State Department of Health mapping effort to identify communities that are highly impacted by fossil fuel pollution and climate change in Washington. And after the utilities identify these populations and communities through census tract information and other data, the Commission's rules require the utilities to work with communities to develop customer benefit indicators that can be used to measure and reflect actions, programs, or resources that will provide the benefits of a clean energy transition or the reduction of burdens. However, although Washington has provided significant direction to utilities by statute and through rules. We're just beginning our journey to ensure energy equity. And so I look forward to hearing from the panelists today, because they're going to help all of us explore these issues, how to collect, report, and analyze energy sector data to empower energy equity. First, we're going to hear from Subin Devar. Subin is a co-founder and director of the Initiative for Energy Justice, a national research center that provides law and policy resources to advocates and policymakers to advance state-level transitions to equitable renewable energy. Next, we'll hear from Mariel Thrasingham. Mariel is an environmental law and policy specialist, leading Front and Centered's commitment to advancing the clean energy interests of frontline communities in Washington that are historically and disproportionately harmed by climate change. After we hear from Mariel, we'll hear from Lauren Roth. Lauren is Senior Director of Policy at AC Tripoli, where she oversees state and local policy work as well as utility regulation, conducting program and policy research, and providing technical assistance to a variety of groups aimed at advancing equitable energy efficiency. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Hassan Shaban. Hassan, the Principal for Energy and Data at EmpowerWorks, is a data scientist and mechanical engineer who works with utility clients on full life cycle support for energy equity and energy efficiency programs, and provides strategic consulting to customer program teams in the area of program design and evaluation. So we're going to turn first to Subin. So Subin, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Rendell. I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to get to what you came for and talk about energy, but I think it makes sense to talk about equity before the amazing folks on this panel really get into the weeds. I thought about this a little bit, and I figured instead of giving you something you could Google, I'll tell you what I think. And just to put it simply, to me, equity is a lot like common sense if you include people and data. And I want to unpack that a little bit and offer a few frameworks today. But by that I mean equity is a lot about what happens if you include people in a process, a diversity of people who typically can't usually access that process, and what happens if you really look at the data, what that variety of people have suffered or impacted or benefited from in the past, their present, and their future. But I want to give some color to that before I jump into the concept of energy justice, which I want to also sort of set the stage with explaining. Yesterday, I came across a news story that I found surprising, and it's very timely for what's going on right now. And it turns out that women typically, vaccines don't work as well on women, and it may be linked to the fact that we've been testing vaccines on male mice. And it's just, you often hear these stories. There's various different stories of, because we left out this population, this community, or a certain person designed a study, the outcomes are biased to that way that we started. And I think that, to me, gets to the heart of equity. What happens when we include people, a diversity of people? What happens when we really include a thoughtful look at data? You can go to the next slide, please. And thank you to the NARUC team for putting this together and for organizing. I want to offer 3 frameworks. And since this is going to be a real fly-through presentation, I want to note at the start, I'm going to just offer these up. You can go to our website. I don't know if someone's able to drop it into the chat. It's just iejusa.org, and the 3 frameworks that I mentioned are all there. But I'll just go through and just offer them. The first one is an energy justice scorecard, and if I was to leave you with one thing, it's to try to offer what energy equity or energy justice is, and we use that, at least at IEJ, those terms interchangeably. And I'd say in its simplest form, if it was just down to one phrase, energy equity is the equitable distribution of benefits and burdens. And you'd have to unpack all of that, and there's a longer version of that. And what I want to do maybe is just offer little stages of if I gave you a longer version of it, and more and more. If I was to say a little bit more about it, Energy equity refers to the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation in the energy system, while also remediating social, economic, and health burdens on those who have been disproportionately harmed by the energy system. So it's both looking forward and looking back, and it explicitly centers the concerns of communities that have been on the front line of pollution or are or will continue to be on the front line of climate change impacts, as well as working class people, Black and Indigenous communities, and those historically disenfranchised by racial and social inequity. And the scorecard that is on this slide here and that you can access on our website is our effort to sort of unpack that even further. How do you really get into the nitty-gritty on whether a policy is achieving energy justice or not? And this scorecard is hard to read, so if you go to the next slide, we just pull out the heart of it. This scorecard is this one-page document that you'll find on our website that's part of a longer workbook, an energy justice workbook, which is even longer. So again, to the levels that you want to get into it, really defines and explains what energy equity and energy justice is. But I wanted to highlight what this framework is based on. It's these 5 elements that we get into around process, restoration or restorative justice, decision-making, benefits, and access. And these are 5 ways to think about what does equity in the energy system look like. And all of this really will tie into why data and metrics are really important to answer these questions. But essentially, these 5 components cover a breadth of how to get to that one phrase I said, the equitable distribution of benefits. That the distribution of benefits cannot really be equitable unless there's equitable process. And so that's just kind of where things start. That's meaningful participation from the public that proactively reaches out to those folks who are most impacted and have typically not been able to be involved. I won't go into each of these elements, but I just wanted to share this framework and offer it and note that it's on our website. But you can go to the next slide. The next thing I want to point out, the second framework, is really what gets to the heart of how can we define and assess equity in the energy sector, but how do we more so concretely measure equity? And we recently, just last week, put out a report called the Justice in 100 Metrics that lays out a framework, an accountability framework. Again, I'm not going to go into it in much detail, but I want to just set up this framework here and point out a couple of the pieces. We break out things into utility actions, those specific steps that electric utilities can take to advance equity, and how those ultimately are trying to get to equity indicators, or in the Washington State context, for example, what CETA, in the implementation of CETA, what Washington State regulators are asking utilities to develop and calling customer benefit indicators. You can go to the next slide. And in between these utility actions and this ultimate indicator in the world is what we call an utility equity target. And so below that in this slide, I've given an example of like, what is an action, what is a target, and what is an indicator to really measure equitable progress towards decarbonization. So take, for example, if ultimately you want to decrease energy burden, then you might achieve that by reducing electric bills for a certain number of customers, and you want to set a target. Well, then how do you do that? And you might implement a specific program or policy, such as net energy metering, that would achieve that. You can go to the last slide. So if I had like an hour, I would dive into all of this further, but I just want to leave you with this last framework that I think for us boils down how to approach equity in regulatory matters, starting with defining the process with restorative justice, ensuring that there's really meaningful implementation, participation, and that informs the next step, which is to have adequate reporting to really be able to hold the utility sector and the energy sector accountable. We need to measure the things that we want to evaluate and that we want to hold the utility accountable for. And I'll just wrap by closing and saying, what I hope folks take away again is that that energy equity is more than just the idea of income or just one thing. It's about this inquiry and this process of including people and including data. And it's a lot about what you don't know. And I think the idea that equity could be, really just answered by one list of things, it would be missing the point. And so I hope you, consider these frameworks and appreciate the opportunity to share these with y'all, and look forward to the questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Subin. That was a great summary, and the report you've put together is really very complete and very helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mariel, let's turn to you.
Hello. Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that was working. So we just heard an excellent presentation from Subin, who has been a critical partner for Front and Centered in thinking through those frameworks and how they apply to the clean energy transition in Washington State. Front and Centered is a coalition organization of over 70 different kind of community-based groups that are run by and serve the interests of communities of color throughout Washington. And we are really concerned with ensuring that frontline communities have a voice in policy world and decisions around environmental and climate-related activities. And we also want to build the capacity of those communities to not only engage in policy, but to have ownership over the processes that impact their world and their communities. And community health has really been sort of the driver in our entree into kind of the energy sector and wanting to ensure that the decisions that were made around energy accessibility and transitioning off of fossil fuels towards 100% clean energy, that they really centered kind of frontline communities. And so we are really thinking about having an equitable transition that is reflected in outcomes that are beneficial for these communities. And so that has been kind of the frameworks that IEJ kind of helped us set up and think through, and what we have been presenting through the rulemaking process and other forms of engagement on these policies have really been about that. What are the outcomes on people? What are the outcomes on communities of various policies around the transition? And so as Commissioner Rendell laid out at the start of this event, the Clean Energy Transformation Act presents a series of steps that utilities have to take to transition fully off of fossil fuel serviced electricity to clean power within a certain time frame. And there are stages of achieving that. And utilities are at different places when it comes to arriving there. But the equity implications are very significant as well. And so that critical feature of CETA, the requirement that utilities account for, ensure that all customers benefit from an equitable transition, and that the benefits are equitably distributed, is something that hasn't really been seen, that isn't seen that much in other in other jurisdictions, and it's really new to the scene in Washington. And so understanding what is an equitable distribution of benefits and reduction of burdens, and how that plays out really involves understanding who are the communities, or how are communities impacted, who is impacted the most, where are the disparities, and what about the different features of how utilities will take on the transition will result in beneficial outcomes around public health. And as I said, that is one of the primary lenses that Front and Center has helped bring to the discussion in the work that we have done on the environmental and health disparities map produced with the University of Washington and the Department of Health. And Front and Center continues to engage in keeping that up to date. That environmental health disparities mapping allows for overlaying different socioeconomic and demographic features of census tracts all around the state, and environmental harms and conditions. And with the addition of the climate elements, it shapes into the cumulative impact analysis. And that's still being worked on, but right now it provides a really critical tool for visualizing how people are affected, how communities are already very disparately positioned in light of different kind of environmental conditions around emissions and pollution, just different public health outcomes, education, literacy, and demographic features around age, ability, and race and ethnicity. And so that visualization sets up understanding who are the highly impacted communities, where, in which census tracts are the highest rates of health impacts of disparate health outcomes seen, and how can utilities take that information into consideration in applying towards planning around clean energy transitioning to clean energy in the operational decisions they make. And the equity lens is about just correcting that disparity where there is harm, and where that harm can be perpetuated by utility decisions around purchasing, siting, taking down existing kind of fixed assets that might be high emitting, just storage, delivery, transmission, who they hire, who they subcontract with. All sorts of utility decisions have equity kind of implications, some of which can really more directly link to a harm or risk to a population, and some of which are just highlight a potential benefit. Where are resources flowing around? Well, wealth resources. Is there a potential for wealth creation in communities that are the most disparately harmed by kind of historical conditions, and by the fact that so many benefits that usually come from environmental legislation seem to be delivered to communities that are already at a more advantageous position. So redirecting that and really bringing forth the highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations to a place where they can be the first to draw benefits from the transition has been really critical. And we think that that is exactly what is contained in the equitable distribution mandate in CETA. And data is how we know. Like the definition of highly impacted community is those census tracts where the environmental, public health, and other harms are most concentrated, and they are ranked in the disparities mapping, in the environmental health disparities mapping, and the highest ranks, the 9 and 10 census tracts. Those are kind of the areas that need to be kind of targeted for benefits and resources. And the vulnerable populations are defined differently, but in terms of the kind of experiences and socioeconomic kind of conditions that allow for those populations who might be spread out differently, but they can be thoughtfully considered in utilities decisions around targeted programming. And you're going to hear more kind of about it throughout this event, but I hope that you take away just how critical it is that the data that is gathered by utilities in Washington under the requirements of CETA, that it just consider all of the broad dimensions of impact that utility operations have, and that it's not just about that one direct kind of standard operation that utilities are most familiar with, like provide power at cheapest rate possible, but where you get it, how you deliver it, who is experiencing more or less of kind of the benefits of working with utilities, of being in this part of the service area or otherwise. So it's really just about expansion of just your understanding of utilities as institutions of influence, of incredible influence within a geography. And well, that wraps up, but I'll have more to say later in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mariel. And you can see what a gorgeous day it is in the Seattle area today. I wish I was outside like Mariel. It looks lovely. We don't get that very much in March, so it's a rare day to enjoy. So now we're going to turn to Lauren Ross. So please go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Commissioner Randall. Let me turn on my video. Okay, there we go. So hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be part of this panel, and I thank NABRC for the invitation. As mentioned, I'm Lauren Ross, Senior Director of Policy with AC Tripoli. Next slide, please. For those of you not familiar with AC Tripoli, we are a nonprofit research organization committed to advancing energy efficiency as a leading strategy to tackle climate change in a way that works for everyone. We work across sectors and focus on policy at the local, state, federal, and utility levels. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about AC Tripoli's state research and our ongoing efforts to really integrate equity into this work, into really all that we do. And I'll also probably allude to some of the data challenges already mentioned today. But to start, I always say, if you know AC Tripoli, you know our scorecards. We do a lot of them. For this audience, you're probably most familiar with our state energy efficiency scorecard. I have the 2020 rankings here on the right side of the screen. But we do a number of scorecards. We do a state energy efficiency scorecard, utility energy efficiency scorecard, city clean energy scorecard, and we just did for this year the first time a transportation electrification scorecard. And all of our scorecards are very nuanced assessments of energy efficiency for cities, broadly clean energy efforts at the different policy levels. And I should say we really focus on policy and performance where we can. Data is certainly an issue on the performance side, but we do look at policy performance across various sectors. And I said it's very nuanced in that our scorecards, yes, they're meant to provide a ranking and to some level promote peer competition, but they're very detailed, and we hope that they serve as roadmaps for policy action around energy efficiency. So integrating equity, as I'll mention in a minute, is really top of mind for us and a priority. And I also provide here on the slide just a list of some of the other research activities. Again, very focused on energy efficiency. We get very much into the weeds on policy and technology as well. And I present this list, and I'll say too, going forward, anything from AC Tripoli, you should see a much stronger focus on equity throughout. Next slide, please. And given the audience, I just want to spend an additional moment talking about our state scorecard and its goals. As I mentioned, it's really meant to provide an annual benchmark of state energy efficiency policies and progress, and also offer a comparative tool to direct states towards efficiency policies, best practices, and case studies from high-ranking states and regional neighbors. This scorecard in particular addresses 5 different sectors: appliance standards, state government initiatives, building energy policies, transportation policies, and utility and public benefit programs and policies. And I think moving forward, and as I'll talk now kind of about our ongoing efforts around equity, our goal for this work is that moving forward, leaders, let's say the top 10 states, don't just represent those with maybe the biggest and best energy efficiency policies, but are leading in equity. And we want our scoring to reflect that. For the first time ever, we're taking a year off from doing the state scorecard this year to really reorient the strategy around equity. And
Lauren?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I think some folks might not be able to see the slides. Dominic, do you mind checking to see if the presentation mode is up correctly?
I see the slide.
Okay, yeah, I can see it. Let me see if folks. Okay, yeah, it looks like people are saying they can see it.
And we can actually transition to the next slide. So I present this I want to say our basic approach to equity, or what our approach has been to equity and energy efficiency. We've been spending the last few years, especially working with cities, to really operationalize equity within local energy efficiency policy. And I feel like Subin did a really great job of kind of laying out the different equity dimensions. And the idea is to take our current framework and really align it with what much deeper focus on equity. But in the meantime, we've been focusing on the looking back, looking forward, trying to address previous inequities around energy, housing, health, and thinking about the process that goes into energy efficiency policy, clean energy policy making, and then also the policies. And so that's kind of what you see here in this diagram. We've been looking at utility programs. How are utility programs set up to reach historically underserved households? How does spending on those programs relate to other residential programs? How do small businesses benefit? How do non-residential customers in specific neighborhoods benefit from energy efficiency investments on behalf of utilities? And so these are the kind of ways we've chipped at this over recent years. We also look at transportation is a big piece of energy efficiency. We also look at access to transit, affordability of transit, transit-oriented development, again, to hopefully correct some of the historically discriminatory zoning policies of the past. More and more, we're looking at workforce development. How can utilities themselves increase greater diversity and inclusiveness within their own workforce development efforts? What's the role of cities and states in this area? We also look at direct incentives and financing available to different customer segments, particularly those that we know to be overburdened by energy costs. And then lastly, but maybe I probably should have said this first, we, especially on the city side, have developed a methodology to assess how well cities are creating the space for communities to engage in decision making, and the extent to which they're accountable to social equity in their efforts, which is tricky to always capture from a metric or indicator standpoint, but something we're actively working on. Next slide, please. So all that being said, we have a lot of room for improvement on our state scorecard. In the scorecard now, we look at utilities, commitments to low-income energy efficiency, regulatory policies that influence cost-benefit testing, which would influence the amount of funding and program eligibility for these households. This is a very limited view, but it's also reflective of the data available from utilities, and something I'll speak to where we need to see room for improvement. Moving forward, I kind of just presented where we focus more with our work around cities, but moving forward with states and utilities, we want to incorporate more metrics on community engagement, decision-making, workforce development, and adoption of internal protocols and metrics for accountability, to equity, to the community, and related goals and targets. And I think the larger question here, which has been mentioned today, is how do we assess the social distribution of benefits with such limited data? That's something we're grappling with. I imagine going forward in our scorecards, data is going to be something that utilities and states will be assessed on, availability of data. And I like to think where we are now, where we are in 2 years on this front, will look a lot different. Next slide, please. So in wrapping up, I just want to quickly mention how we're going about this process. And if anyone on this call or is interested in being engaged, feel free to reach out to me. But I had mentioned early on that AC Tripoli is committed to integrating equity in all of our research, and especially our scorecards. But at the end of the day, we are a national nonprofit organization. So how do we really ensure we're leading with equity, and that our leaders in the scorecards are leaders because they have a strong focus on equity? So to really go forward in this way, we have developed launched our Leading with Equity initiative. And the goals of the initiative are to ensure that frontline communities are represented and are helping to drive the development of a full landscape of improved equity-related metrics. We want them to have the data that they need in their own efforts. Better understand current utility, city, and state capacity to report on desired metrics, and how do we change those regulatory frameworks. And then lastly, we want to generate proposed changes to our scorecards. Like I said, the scorecards we'd like to think aren't an end in and of themselves, but instead they really set the bar in a way for future progress on energy efficiency, and we want them to really represent performance on metrics that matter most to communities. Next slide, please. And to reach these goals, we are convening community-based organizations, advocates, and utilities in a series of workshops to get to a better understanding of the metrics that are prioritized among communities. And again, to focus on the role for utilities here, making sure that data is available. We want to work together with these groups to define success for equitable decarbonization. And we want to embed these metrics in to AC Tripoli's scorecards. And I think that's it. I think I'll end there, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We appreciate your presentation. That's great information. And now we're going to turn to Hassan.
All right, thanks, Anne. I have to start this by saying I'm not a policy guy. So my work is more boots on the ground, helping utilities kind of bridge the gap between their work and all of these equity policies and goals and so on. So I asked Commissioner Randolph, what's she interested in hearing about when it comes to utilities and equity? And she asked two discrete questions. First one was, where are utilities today when it comes to their equity work? And the second one was, how can commissions support utilities in this work? So I'm going to spend the next few minutes trying to answer those two questions. If you want a lot more detail about utility data and metrics and all of that stuff, check out the quantitative energy equity white paper that's in the webinar handouts. All right. So where are utilities today in their equity journey? When I think about this, I think about two buckets of utility work. There's the energy assistance programs. So these are things like low-income weatherization and bill discounts, for example. And then there's the power planning side of things. So this is what power plants should we build, where should we site them, where should we put the substations. And those two buckets of work are at very different stages of maturity when it comes to equity. For example, for energy assistance programs, there's already a lot of data and research and frameworks out there on how you assess equity in your programs. This is one that I use directly with utilities, and then we've kind of proposed it for use in Washington State. But it breaks down progress of energy assistance programs into three metrics. The first one is the funding ratio. So how much funding is available in the programs relative to the need in the community. The second one is operational effectiveness. So how good are programs at converting those budget dollars to actual customer bill savings? And the third one is targeting effectiveness. So how good are programs at reaching the customers who need it the most, who have the highest burden? In general, I'd say that programs are surprisingly actually not super underfunded. So I like most programs that I see have between 50 and 100% of the need in their community already budgeted for. Operational effectiveness is hit or miss. So some programs are really well run. Others are not so well run, very poorly run. I say it's almost the equivalent of piling up a bunch of money in your backyard and setting fire. The third metric when it comes to targeting, it's usually low across the board. So many programs aren't really thinking about how they target specific customers who have the highest need. But overall, for these things, there are already best practices out there. So these are things that utilities can directly work on and improve. When it comes to power planning, the conversations are a lot earlier on. So it's definitely not as advanced as thinking about programs. I'll just point out here that last month I helped facilitate this forum about equity and power planning for utilities in the Northwest. Jasmine will probably paste the link to that forum in the chat, and there's a bunch of resources in there. But we were really starting the conversation about what does equity and power planning mean in the first place. Like we didn't know, so we asked the participants, we asked the utilities who were attending, the community-based organizations, and this is more or less what they said. Depending on what their background was, they had different priorities. Depending on whether they worked in energy efficiency programs or power planning, or whether they came from a community organization, they told us different things. The one promising observation, though, is that they all agreed on two things: that equitable power planning means that any decisions you make result in clean, affordable energy. The rest of it, I'd say there's room for negotiation. So, for example, the community organizations really had a focus on this inclusive process. The demand forecasting or back-end utility operations folks were really focused in on this idea of system reliability and resilience. And then the energy efficiency and demand response program folks, they were really focused on housing quality. But at the core of it, we have a great point to start: clean, affordable energy. When you're doing power planning, let's focus on those things. Now, how can commissions support utilities in their equity work? I've condensed these into 5 major ideas. The first one is to understand that utilities are a very convenient entity to kind of pin a lot of the responsibility on, but oftentimes they're not the only ones that have a hand in impacting these things that we're talking about. So, for example, many utilities don't run their own energy assistance programs. They're maybe run by community-based organizations or community action councils. Many utilities, especially in the Northwest and in the Southeast, they don't do their own power planning. So they purchase power from regional organizations like BPA and the Tennessee Valley Authority. And utilities certainly they don't go out and build solar panels and EVs and try to sell them to customers. That's more the purview of these distributed energy resource vendors. So I'm not saying take the responsibility off of utilities' plate, but I'm saying that what commissions can do here is act more as conveners, as reaching out, say, to the state energy offices that manage a lot of these programs, or reach out to the regional power organizations like BPA and TVA, or collaborate with industry associations related to solar and EVs and so on. Utilities are just one piece of the puzzle. The second major theme is language matters. I think if commissions during rulemaking or when they're offering guidance, if the language is crystal clear, that would help utilities out a lot. So to give an example here, I just put this first sentence is the goal of LIHEAP, which is probably the biggest energy assistance program in the country. They use a lot of adverbs and qualifiers, which to me, if I'm reading this from a utility perspective, I say that there's a bunch of optional stuff that we may or may not do. The core of it is really assisting households with low incomes. It doesn't matter if you're a good program or if you're a bad program, usually you are assisting households with low income. So it's a very low bar to set. Instead, if you set a very specific goal, like saying, reduce the energy assistance need by X% by this year, that's a very concrete thing that utilities can work towards. And then you can give utilities the flexibility and execution and how they actually get to that goal. And that's super important because utilities know their service territories, they know their customers better than anyone. The third idea here, it's just a roundabout way of saying, speak the language that utilities speak. So oftentimes, we are talking about maps and census tracts and geographic this. Maps are cool, but utilities don't see maps. They see grids. They see customers, meters, neighborhoods. And whenever you're setting up frameworks for them to report on metrics or indicators, I would really love to see that coming from that level of granularity. so that utilities actually understand how they can impact those metrics. If I serve these 500 customers, that's going to reflect in my top level metric. Versus having more of a top-down approach where you say, hey, here's a very general metric, now go try to hit it. That's a very hard thing to do. I won't dwell too much on this one. There's a bunch of, again, resources and research around equity data. As commissioners, as commissions, you're probably going to run into this a lot where you're trying maybe to frame some policy. And you get pushback around, hey, this data is really hard to get or it's really expensive. I'd say in general, many of these data problems have either already been solved or they're being worked on. So it's just a matter of knowing where to look. So don't get thwarted by people pushing back because data is difficult. Data shouldn't be that hard now. The final point here is about really, it's more about utility staff. So I'm always curious, what would make utility staffers, again, boots on the ground, what would make them change the way they work to achieve energy equity? So we asked them, at that same forum that I mentioned earlier, we had a bunch of utility staffers from across the Northwest. There are about 70 or 80 of them. And we said, hey, what would make you do something about energy equity? This is what they said. They said, well, we care a lot about achieving energy equity. Almost a 6 out of a 7. Their top reason for caring about energy equity was that they had a personal sense of fairness and justice, that they wanted to see this reflected in their work. Regulation wasn't one of the top things on the list. It was actually pretty low, even though many of these utilities actually have regulations that they need to meet related to energy equity. So the one takeaway here I'd say is that utility staffers are usually very supportive of energy equity. It's just that policy and regulations by themselves won't necessarily get them there. I think if commissions support utilities by setting clear goals, making sure that the metrics and indicators are actually practical, collaborating, with other entities that have an impact on these things, as well as maybe thinking more holistically about energy equity. It's not just about checking a box for legislation, but there are other benefits for utilities when they're implementing these policies and programs. So I'm going to stop here. You guys are going to help me build my data set. So I'm inviting you to answer that same question about what's your personal driver for acting on energy equity. There's a poll link that's pasted in the chat. Please go there. It's a quick two-question poll. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Anne for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Hassan. That was great. And if you do get a chance to look at the materials for the Northwest Power Council, it was a great conference. I wish I'd been able to attend. So we have a few minutes. We have about 12 minutes left in our webinar today, and I have some questions that have been coming in from the audience. So I'm going to turn to those first. We have some other questions. If we have time, we'll turn to those. But I think the first one I'll start with, maybe start with you, Mariel, because you've been engaged in this. What would you recommend in terms of policy changes to encourage utilities and regulators to consider equity in their planning and decision making? And I guess this would be in the absence of legislation. So we had the benefit of legislation in Washington, but in the absence of legislation, how would you recommend utilities and regulators consider this in their planning and decision making?
I think a lot of it needs to come from the leadership, obviously establishing just an appreciation in the bodies, in the different regulatory agencies for learning and for understanding equity and for exploring that and having conversations. Having equity in mission statements and making sure that there is there is a space for community organizations, and not just those who are primed to kind of advocate and are very familiar with being in regulatory spaces, but those who are really in communities and are more or less distrusting or not on the surface very interested in kind of being brought into those discussions, but that there are opportunities shaped for a forum for engagement and for those conversations. And I think it's defining a policy for kind of getting leadership revved up around that and having those conversations and those educational opportunities in place. It is, I mean, it can be all over the place. It's really, it's about will and it's about resources. So policies that really ensure that there's a budget for that form of engagement and that form of learning, and that that entities are coming together. I feel like that is a really essential part of more deeply embedding equity in all forms of ongoing action in the regulatory sphere and policy decision making.
Great, thank you. Does anyone want to add to that, to Mariel's answer? I think she captured it pretty well. Okay, there's a question from the audience about, are there good existing examples of how utilities are incorporating equity into their programs? I think, Hassan, you talked about a bit about, you know, I think the most typical example is in the low-income assistance programs, but there's obviously a lot more to do. Is anyone aware of some best practices out there? Is this really, are we on the cutting edge of putting this together?
I think in general, there has been a lot of work. I mean, utilities do a lot of this work internally. I'd say that the one public study that I can think of was one that was, again, actually hosted by the Northwest Power Council a couple of years ago. And this was more looking at programs in general and quantifying how regular programs, so outside low-income programs, how are just regular programs for energy efficiency and so on, how are they doing with regards to equity? So good. I wish, maybe I'll pull it up and paste it in the chat. How's that? But that's a good example. It gives you concrete case studies of how to look at this, how to look at equity in the programs.
Okay, great, thanks. And Lauren, actually, Subin, I'm going to turn to you. In her presentation, Lauren mentioned that there are some current gaps in data for measuring equity that currently exist. Although I think, Hassan, you said it's all out there, it's already ready to go. So how can we close that gap or the perceived gap of data? And I guess either Hassan or Subin, either one of you take that question.
Yeah. I mean, I think I wouldn't disagree with Hassan. I think maybe it's kind of the difference between having a fire hose on your block, but not feeling like you have good water in your house. And data is, I think, very much not a question of quantity, but decision making and questions and narrowing down the effectiveness of it. You know, I think what's interesting in the regulatory sector for utilities is primed to answer this question. It just there just needs to be a paradigm shift in what costs and benefits are we looking at. And I think, yes, there's this understanding, like we all get the costs in terms of monetary costs and benefits in terms of monetary benefits, and that's where we can align in terms of let's measure that so we know what customers are paying a lot and which customers are not. You know, we can balance that out. That's a great place to start. But the big gap is in everything that's not monetary. Like the people who have been bearing the blunt of or the brunt of costs for the energy system, they're not measured in their bills. And so I think what we've started to do is start to measure pollution. But what's next after that? I mean, and states are making leaps and bounds in that. But other than just measuring where, in what census tract is there pollution, what is the cost of that? What's the cost of going to the hospital more often than your neighbor, or having asthma, or missing your job, or losing a loved one? The federal government, has been, and many research institutes have been trying to, come up with social costs for pollution and climate change, but that's the next frontier. And I think thinking about that from a utility standpoint, both in the costs as well as the benefits, that's in one way a gap, because the benefits are similar. The benefits are not just reducing your electricity bill. That's an important place to start, but it's also the wealth benefits. We're talking about the growth of an industry for the millions and billions of dollars, and who's seeing that benefit, who are seeing the jobs created, and a number of other things. And so yeah, I'd say that's an important place to think about. Like, the data is out there, but how do we funnel it into the decision making at the regulatory and utility level? And maybe the last part is also, it's a gap in who's involved. There's so much data to process. It's a matter of who you turn to ask what they care about. And so I think, to Marielle's point about who's involved in a process, that's going to steer like what data you care about and what data you look at. And so if people are included in a process and say, this is the sort of thing that we care about, then you'll go and look for the data that's relevant to those issues.
Can I add one thing?
Thank you.
Onto that?
Yeah, because I was going to turn to you, so you go ahead and you might answer my question.
Sure. So Subin, I completely agree. And the way that I'm thinking about it is, and Hassan, as you said, the data is technically available at times, but utilities in particular, I don't see connecting the dots in terms of to take it further, to target programs, to set goals with equity in mind. And they're really well positioned to do so. Not to mention, think about the intersection between pollution, indoor air quality, health generally, and programs. Two, on the energy efficiency side in particular, I've struggled with why utilities don't often design programs around bill arrearages, and like access and eligibility is not often streamlined around households with high bill arrearages, and like that data is there. One direction, this speaks to an earlier question too, that I see some utilities moving towards, a small fraction, but again, it speaks to that ability to kind of connect the dots and see what's needed to make these investments work for the communities that need them the most, like broadening eligibility, looking at geography, trying to get past some of those kind of limited eligibility outreach efforts that have become so traditional in the utility space. And so I think, how can we get utilities to think outside the box with data, really get programs to benefit? How can we bring people into decision making to utilize that data? I think too that like, if we really want to get towards equitable outcomes, we need frontline communities represented through the data processing piece of it to make sure that data is used in a way that really does maximize the benefit to communities. So that's a lot of ideas, but all to say,
Lauren, I completely agree with you. I think it's, it speaks to the disconnect, especially when you have policy making that's disconnected from program implementation and boots on the ground stuff. I think if a utility has a customer insights team or a data analytics team, that they have all the data in there and they can do a lot of cool stuff, and a lot of them already are. It's just a matter of specifying, hey, this is your target, now go hit it. If that happens, and that's by the way, the greatest thing about CETA is that it just does just that, right? It says, hey, here's a clear target, just go do it. I think we start there, and then the data and the analysis and all that will follow.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, and I have so many questions, and this is such a good conversation. We could keep going, and maybe we'll have to have a part 2 of this conversation. One of the really good questions that came up at the end is, how do you, and we can't answer it, but it's just a good question, is that utilities have tended to raise the concern, I guess, about privacy. They don't want to collect customer income or demographic data And so we have to figure out how to address this because, as you said, they have the arrearage data, but they may not have some of the other data, and they're hesitant to collect that data, especially in this area of privacy. So that's maybe another question to talk about in another forum. This has been great, but I have to turn this over to Dominic because he has a last thing he needs to tell all of us. I just want to thank all of you for your participation today and your presentations and your answers. So thanks very much. Dominic, I think I'm out of time.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Rendall. Yep, so you should be seeing my screen now. We have some upcoming webinars. In April, we have a webinar on our CAT initiative. And then in May, we have another webinar on staffing for POCs, retaining, good retention and all sorts of tactics. So that's what's coming up. And I hope to have you guys join us again. It's good talking with all of you. Thank you all, panelists and Commissioner, for putting this together. And obviously, Jasmine McAdams, thank you so much for all the work you did to organize us and put everything together. So with that, I will be ending it. If you need anything, this was recorded and it will be posted on our website. If you want to see where it is through the www.naruc.org/CPI. And if you go to Innovation Webinars, it will be there. Thanks a lot, and I hope to catch you again. Bye.